Okay, so today is kind of an unusual day. A couple of people were sick, and there's one person that normally takes this class at a distance anyway, and so I thought that rather than holding a regular class, I'd just go ahead and record for everybody. Observations today, we're covering parts of chapter 2 and 3 in Mills on the Subjection of Women. And then on Wednesday, I'm hoping, since I won't be here, that everybody has access to Netflix and can look up a documentary called Happy. It's a documentary about, scientific or social scientific research and evidence for what really makes people happy. And I thought, in light of our discussion of utilitarianism and Mill's views, it just might be good to get that updated perspective on what we really know about what makes people happy at this point, and then we can discuss that hopefully on Friday. So do let me know if you can get Netflix. If you can't, I can arrange to have you take a look at it here, or even in class if necessary. Okay, so we're going to move on into chapter 2 of the Subjection of Women. And start with, I put the PowerPoints for this particular section on our 663 audio page. So I'm going to start with this issue of divorce. At the time, divorce was very difficult for women to sue for. There were laws in place that made it easier for men to get a divorce. It wasn't particularly easy for anybody to get a divorce, as it is now with no-fault divorce. But women had to make they could make very few arguments for it. Abuse wasn't good enough, really. I mean, without the husband's consent, it was very difficult for a woman to divorce her husband. And Mill saw that, obviously, as a real problem for women in abusive marriages. Now, I mean, the fact is that even if a woman could have gotten a divorce more easily at this time, it would have been difficult, practically speaking, for her to do so, because so many women, most women, were dependent on their husbands and might have been thrown into poverty as a result. They couldn't go just easily get a job and find some way to take care of themselves. So even if the laws had been changed, women would have still had a problem making that decision. But Mill sees it as inequitable that women don't have this right and can't get out of abusive or neglectful marriages. And over in the right-hand column of page 668, he writes, "This legal separation until now lately, the courts of justice would only give at an expense which made it inaccessible to anyone out of the higher ranks." So that's his first point, is that divorce is something that couldn't even be obtained by people who are not rich, because it cost a lot to do. He says, even now it is only given in cases of desertion or of the extreme of cruelty, and yet complaints are made every day that it is granted too easily. Surely if a woman is denied any lot in life but that of being the personal body servant of a despot, and is independent or is dependent for everything upon the chance of finding one who may be disposed to make a favorite of her instead of merely a drudge, it is a very cruel aggravation of her fate that she should be allowed to try this chance only once. The natural sequel and corollary from this state of things would be that since her all in life depends upon obtaining a good master, she should be allowed to change again and again until she finds one. That would make things very different, wouldn't it? In other words, he's not saying it's not that they can go out immediately and find a way to take care of themselves, but by giving women the right to basically select and select again, they raise their chance of being taken seriously, of being respected, and of finding somebody that they actually are compatible with. Whereas now, basically, it's you throw your lot in for life with this person, and if he turns out to be a despot, a cruel person, or neglectful, then that's too bad. You've basically thrown away that chance. He says, I am not saying that she ought to be allowed this privilege. That is a totally different consideration. The question of divorce, in the sense of involving liberty of remarriage, is one into which it is foreign to my purpose to enter. All I say now is that to those to whom nothing but servitude is allowed, the free choice of servitude is the only, though most insufficient, alleviation. So there he does back away a little bit from the right to remarry, but really not. He's stated what he would prefer, which is that women have that right to remarry and basically be in charge of the selection of husbands, which is totally different. That's kind of flipping things upside down. Okay. So one point that he makes then is that women should be allowed to obtain divorce relatively easily. Second point he makes is that women should be able to compete for jobs and education with men. And this is a huge point that he spends quite a bit of time on. He believes that if women were self-sufficient outside of marriage, then they would have a choice about whether to get married at all. So he's envisioning young women being able to go into the workforce the same as young men. They have that financial power, so they're not looking for a husband primarily because otherwise they will be destitute, which is just a scary thought that compels them into relationships that are not optimal for them. Now, Oken and other feminists point out that Mill doesn't go far enough, as we'll see, because he does think that once you're married and you start having children, generally you shouldn't work. So he's only talking about women working normally until they get married. But still, you can see how that would give them quite a bit more control, and they could decide to wait later to get married. They could decide, some of them, that they didn't want to marry at all. My mom tells me she had several aunts who did not marry or married very late. And my mom's in her 80s, she's 87, so this is going back a ways. Women who were teachers, accountants, nurses, those three occupations, who decided to just not get married. And I've asked her why, and she said because they didn't want to have children, because they knew if they had got married and had children, that basically that's all they would be able to do. And not that that's a small thing, it's a huge thing, but maybe not as big of a deal or not as special if you feel like you're forced into it. So that was fairly common for women to decide that I won't get married, I'll just have a profession. Okay? It does seem unfair, though, to basically give a woman that choice, either marriage or career, but not both. Okay, so a third point that he makes here is that women and men should control their own property in marriage. As it was then, when you got married, the woman's property went to the husband to control, and it became his property. He owned all the family property, he controlled all the finances, and if she were divorced by him, then she would leave without her own property that she came into the marriage with. So this was a great disincentive to that as well. It gave the husband a lot of power in the marriage because he had the financial power. And so Mill wants to change this. He wants to allow men and women both, if they should choose, to keep their property. So let's say if a woman came into a marriage having inherited money, or just having the money that she herself earned from working before getting married, then that's her safety net, so to speak, and she should be able to keep it, unless she really wants to let it go to community property. But even there, Mill says then men and women should both control in a marriage, not just men, how money is spent and how money is invested and so forth. So on the bottom of page 676 over on the left-hand side, he says the rule is simple. Whatever would be the husband's or the wife's if they were not married should be under their exclusive control during marriage, which need not interfere with the power to tie up property by settlement in order to preserve it for children. Some people are sentimentally shocked at the idea of a separate interest in money matters, as inconsistent with the ideal fusion of two lives into one. For my own part, I am one of the strongest supporters of community of goods when resulting from an entire unity of feeling in the owners, which makes all things common between them. But I have no relish for a community of goods resting on the doctrine that what is mine is yours, but what is yours is not mine, and I should prefer to decline entering into such a compact with anyone, though I were myself the person to profit by it. Well, isn't that the truth? What a bad deal that is. If somebody said to you, this only goes one way, if you enter into this contract, you lose your property rights and it's controlled by this other person, but you won't control his, that just sounds like a very bad deal. And it just raises the stakes. You know, if I commit to this person, I risk everything. I risk everything I own, and I just have to hope that he'll take care of it for me and that he will do right by me. So Mill is saying, you know, this may happen. Some cases where men and women are in such a marriage as there is this total trust, then if they both mingle property and are both able to have legal control, that's one thing. And that's kind of what we have now. When people are married, unless they arrange otherwise, their property is community property, meaning that both husband and wife own the property jointly. They both have an equal right to make decisions about how to spend it independently of each other. So literally the husband or the wife could go out and buy a car before asking their spouse. Generally, they don't if they know what's good for them, but that's the way it is. They can, either one of them, independently of the other, can invest $10,000 in a particular stock and not ask ahead of time and so forth. Ideally, what they're supposed to do is consult, and I think in most cases they do, for the sake of marital peace and out of respect. But that's not the law, actually. And community property means either individual can make decisions independently and whenever they want. And there's a great deal of trust that goes into that. So some people, you know, make other arrangements for keeping property separate, and they actually have to create special legal contracts to do so, prenuptial contract, for instance. So anyway, he's not precluding community property, but he is saying that you ought to have the right to keep it separate. And maybe, you know, Mill would probably advocate for that as the default. Okay, the default is keeping the property separate upon marriage, and the choice would be whether to mingle. Now, still, in most marriages of his day, men would come into the marriage with a lot more money and financial power. So he's not totally equalizing things here at all, but he is saying that it's unfair to take what a woman has away from her without her consent. Sounds reasonable. Okay, so then another proposition he makes is for political power for women. This is huge as well. Okay, these are just huge changes that, if they were all implemented, would make a real revolution. And as you know, they all were eventually, or something close to what he's talking about. But here he notes, you know, women can't vote. Women were supposed to be represented by their husbands, but he does not think that women always are represented by their husbands, or that husbands always think about their wives' interests before they decide to vote. And that men and women can have different points of view, political and social. He says if we gave women the right to vote and gave them political power, then laws against domestic violence would be more meaningful, because they would have teeth in them and they would be stronger. Apparently there were some laws against